most practical way to get the land is to occupy the unoccupied land, to put pressure on the state. And it has worked, because now the state and the owners of the land are beginning to say, maybe we should do something.
Is Africa finally reclaiming its land, or is this a risky gamble? For centuries, foreign ownership of African land has been a hotly debated issue, leading to displacement, economic control, and even conflicts. But now Burkina Faso has taken a bold step. Foreigners can no longer own agricultural land. The government has passed a law that ensures land stays in African hands, with only citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger allowed to own mining land as well. So, is this the start of a new era of self-reliance, or is the continent still too tied to external forces? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. For centuries, land in Africa has been a highly contested resource, often slipping from the hands of the people who live on it. Colonization, land grabs, and foreign ownership have shaped the continent's agricultural and economic landscape in ways that continue to affect African nations today. But in an unexpected and bold move, Burkina Faso has decided to take back control of its land. The government, according to some sources, has passed a law that completely bans foreign ownership of agricultural land, ensuring that only Burkina-Faso citizens can permanently own it. This decision has stirred up intense debates. Some see it as a necessary step toward economic sovereignty, while others warn of potential unintended consequences. But why did Burkina Faso make this decision now, and what does it mean for the country's future?
Of their land.
People of South Africa of all races are working together through Parliament and indeed a number of other formations and legal platforms to find a solution to this historic challenge.
The timing of this law is not random. Over the past few years, Burkina Faso has undergone a political and ideological transformation, shifting away from Western influence and looking toward African unity and self-reliance. The leadership under Captain Ibrahim Traoré has been vocal about reclaiming national assets and prioritizing the interests of the Burkinabe people. Land, being one of the most valuable assets a nation possesses, was naturally the next area of focus. But beyond political symbolism, this move has very real economic and social motivations that reflect the country's struggle against neo-colonial economic structures that have long favored foreign investors over local communities. For decades, foreign corporations and wealthy individuals have been acquiring large swaths of farmland in Burkina Faso, often under the guise of investment in agriculture. While these investments were marketed as beneficial, bringing infrastructure, technology, and employment, the reality on the ground has often been different. Many of these foreign-owned farms operated without significant local participation, using cheap labor from Burkinabe farmers who had little say in how the land was managed. In some cases, entire communities found themselves displaced from ancestral lands, forced to work as laborers on land that once belonged to them. This created a paradoxical situation where foreigners reaped profits while locals struggled for basic access to land and resources. This issue is not unique to Burkina Faso. Across Africa, similar patterns have played out, with governments granting long-term land rights to foreign investors in the hope of boosting agricultural exports. However, these arrangements often prioritized foreign markets over local food security, leading to situations where vast quantities of crops were being grown for export, while local populations remained food insecure. Burkina Faso's decision to ban foreign ownership of agricultural land can be seen as a direct response to these failed policies. By ensuring that land remains in Burkinabe's hands, the government aims to restore control over food production, reduce dependency on foreign agribusinesses, and create a system where profits stay within the country. The reaction to this law has been mixed. Many Burkinabe citizens have celebrated it as a long overdue correction to an unjust system. Farmers and local cooperatives now see an opportunity to reclaim land that was previously out of their reach. The government has also reassured the public that this move is not about closing the doors to foreign investment, but rather about creating a more balanced and fair system. Foreign investors will still be allowed to lease land for up to 99 years, but they will no longer be able to buy it outright. This means that while they can still operate in Burkina Faso, they must do so on terms that benefit the local population rather than permanently extracting wealth from the country. Critics, however, argue that restricting foreign ownership could potentially slow down investment in Burkina Faso's agricultural sector. Some have suggested that without direct ownership, foreign investors may be less willing to commit long-term resources to developing farmland. However, this argument ignores the fact that many other countries have successfully adopted similar policies without deterring investment. Ethiopia, for example, has long had a system where foreigners can only lease land rather than own it, and this has not stopped large-scale agricultural projects from flourishing. Burkina Faso appears to be following a similar model, ensuring that investment continues, but without the risk of losing land to foreign entities forever. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Another critical aspect of this decision is its potential impact on land speculation and real estate prices. In many African countries, foreign ownership of land has led to rising property values, making it difficult for ordinary citizens to afford land. Wealthy foreign buyers, often backed by multinational corporations or foreign governments, have the financial power to drive up land prices beyond what local farmers can afford. By removing the possibility of foreign ownership, Burkina Faso is likely to stabilize land prices, making it more accessible to local farmers and entrepreneurs. This could pave the way for a more inclusive and sustainable agricultural economy, where Burkinabe citizens have a genuine stake in their country's wealth. Additionally, there is a strong historical and psychological element to this policy. Land in Africa is not just an economic asset. It is deeply tied to identity, heritage, and sovereignty. Many Burkinabe families have lived on the same land for generations, and the idea that it could be permanently owned by foreigners was seen as a continuation of colonial-era injustices. By reclaiming control over agricultural land, Burkina Faso is sending a clear message that its resources are not for sale to the highest bidder. This aligns with the broader Pan-African movement that has been growing in recent years, emphasizing African self-sufficiency and resistance to external control. Despite the enthusiasm surrounding this law, its success will ultimately depend on how effectively it is implemented. The government will need to ensure that local farmers have access to financial support, modern farming techniques, and infrastructure to fully take advantage of this shift. Simply banning foreign ownership is not enough. It must be accompanied by policies that empower Burkinabe citizens to make the most of their land. The challenge ahead is ensuring that the new system does not fall into the hands of corrupt elites, but instead genuinely benefits the ordinary people of Burkina Faso. As this policy takes effect, the world will be watching. Will Burkina Faso become a model for African land reform, or will it face unexpected challenges along the way? One thing is certain. This decision marks a major step towards redefining land ownership in Africa, and it could inspire other nations to rethink their policies. The next few years will determine whether Burkina Faso's bold move becomes a blueprint for success or a cautionary tale. But is Burkina Faso the only one doing so? Burkina Faso's decision to ban foreign ownership of agricultural land was not made in isolation, nor was it a random act of nationalism. This move is deeply rooted in a broader effort to correct historical injustices, secure food sovereignty, and break free from economic dependency that has long benefited foreign entities at the expense of local populations. The decision reflects a growing awareness in Africa that land is more than just an economic asset. It is a source of power, identity, and survival. But why did Burkina Faso take this step now? To understand this, it is essential to look at the factors that led to this moment, from economic exploitation to food insecurity and the changing political landscape in West Africa. For decades, Burkina Faso, like many other African nations, was drawn into a cycle where land became a commodity, controlled by foreign investors rather than a resource for the people. The promise of foreign investment in agriculture was sold as a solution to poverty and underdevelopment, with the idea that allowing international agribusinesses to purchase large amounts of land would lead to improved infrastructure, better farming technology, and job creation. However, in reality, much of this investment failed to uplift local communities. Instead, it led to a model where Burkinabe farmers became laborers on their ancestral lands, working under foreign corporations that dictated the rules. One of the biggest issues with foreign-owned agricultural land was that it prioritized cash crops over food crops. Investors often bought land to grow products meant for export, cotton, sugar, coffee, rather than food that would feed the local population. This meant that while Burkina Faso was exporting tons of produce every year, its people still struggled with food insecurity. Foreign agribusinesses had little interest in developing sustainable food systems for Burkinabe citizens. Their focus was profit, and that meant maximizing yields for global markets, not for local needs. The result was a situation where millions of hectares of fertile land produced wealth for foreign companies, while Burkina Faso relied on food imports. This system became even more exploitative when combined with unfair land leasing agreements. In some cases, foreign investors were granted land for as little as a few dollars per hectare under decades-long agreements, meaning they had near total control over the land without giving back to the local economy. These deals, often signed by previous governments under pressure from international institutions, meant that Burkina Faso lost ownership of key agricultural zones for generations. The benefits of these agreements were rarely seen by ordinary citizens. While a handful of government officials and business elites profited, the majority of Burkinabe farmers remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, unable to compete with the well-funded foreign corporations that dominated the sector. The turning point came as Burkina Faso began to shift away from Western influence and reassess its economic policies. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, the government has made it clear that Burkina Faso's wealth must stay within the country. The question of land ownership became central to this vision. If foreign investors continued to own large portions of farmland, the country would never achieve true sovereignty over its food production. Burkina Faso could not claim independence while its land, its most essential resource, was controlled by external powers. This realization fueled the push to ban foreign ownership of agricultural land and reclaim control over national resources. The law is also a response to a much bigger issue that many African countries have struggled with: the risk of settler colonies forming over time. This is a pattern seen throughout history. Foreign investors enter a country under the pretext of economic development, acquire land, build infrastructure, and over time, develop their enclaves separate from the local population. In some cases, their descendants begin to claim permanent ownership rights, arguing that they were born there and have just as much right to the land as the original inhabitants. This scenario is played out in multiple countries, from South Africa's history of land dispossession to conflicts over land ownership in Zimbabwe and Namibia. The Burkinabe government is keenly aware of this historical pattern and wants to ensure it never happens in Burkina Faso. By banning foreign ownership now, the government is essentially closing the door to future disputes over land rights. But this is not just about preventing external control. It is also about ensuring that Burkinabe farmers have a real chance to thrive. In a country where agriculture employs nearly 80% of the population, land access is a matter of survival. The government's new policy means that young Burkinabe farmers will have greater opportunities to own land, start their farms, and contribute directly to the national economy. This is especially important given the rising youth population in Burkina Faso, many of whom struggle with unemployment and lack of economic opportunities. Without land, they have no path to financial independence. There is also a security dimension to this decision. West Africa has become a region of increasing instability, with insurgencies and conflicts often fueled by economic grievances and land disputes. In many cases, insurgent groups exploit rural populations who feel marginalized or excluded from economic opportunities. When land is controlled by foreigners and local communities feel like they have no stake in their economy, resentment builds. Burkina Faso's government understands that by giving land back to its people, it can reduce economic frustrations that could otherwise be manipulated by destabilizing forces. The stronger the local economy, the less vulnerable people will be to recruitment by insurgent groups. Burkina Faso's ban on foreign ownership is not just a legal change, it is a philosophical shift in how the country views its resources and its future. The government has made it clear that land is not a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. It is a national asset that must be protected. This decision is part of a broader Pan-African movement toward self-sufficiency, challenging decades of economic policies that have left African countries dependent on foreign powers. But how will the world react to this? Land ownership in Africa has always been a deeply political issue, not just within the continent, but also on the global stage. When a country decides to take control of its land and restrict foreign ownership, it does not just face internal challenges. It also risks angering powerful global players who have benefited from Africa's open-door policies. We have already seen how the United States reacted when South Africa proposed land reforms aimed at redistributing land from white settlers to black South Africans. The moment these policies were discussed, Trump's administration responded with threats, diplomatic pressure, and even financial punishments. South Africa, however, refused to back down. Now the question is, will the US or Western powers take a similar approach toward Burkina Faso? And if so, will Burkina Faso be able to resist external pressure? South Africa's land reform proposals ignited a storm of international controversy, particularly in Western media. Headlines painted the South African government as reckless, warning that land redistribution would lead to economic collapse, food shortages, and even a Zimbabwe-style disaster. Trump himself took to Twitter, declaring that he had instructed his administration to investigate South Africa's land reforms, echoing the fears of Western investors who had stakes in South African farmland. This reaction was not about humanitarian concerns or democracy. It was about protecting Western economic interests. The US government, along with Western financial institutions, saw land reform as a direct challenge to the historical dominance of foreign-controlled land ownership in Africa. To send a message, Trump's administration cut aid to South Africa and applied diplomatic pressure in an attempt to force a policy reversal. But despite these threats, South Africa did not abandon its land reform plans. Now, Burkina Faso finds itself in a similar position, but under different circumstances. Unlike South Africa, which has a strong economy and global trade influence, Burkina Faso is a smaller, landlocked nation that has traditionally relied on foreign aid and investment. This makes it a much easier target for economic retaliation if Western powers decide to punish it for banning foreign ownership of agricultural land. If history is any indicator, Washington could respond with financial penalties, possibly cutting aid, blocking investment deals, or discouraging international lenders from doing business with Burkina Faso. The US has used these tactics before, not just against South Africa, but also against Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and Uganda when they pursued policies that threatened Western economic interests. However, Burkina Faso is not as economically dependent on the US as some may think. In recent years, the country has been moving away from Western influence and aligning itself with new strategic partners, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The government under Ibrahim Traoré has been deepening ties with Mali, Niger, Russia, and China, all of whom have shown strong support for African self-reliance and resource nationalism. If the US tries to pressure Burkina Faso economically, the country could look to these allies for financial and strategic backing, similar to how other African nations have responded to Western sanctions. Additionally, Burkina Faso no longer sees Western aid as an untouchable lifeline. Over the past year, the government has already rejected Western financial assistance in key sectors, particularly in agriculture and security. Instead of relying on international donors, Burkina Faso has invested in strengthening domestic industries and regional partnerships. This means that if the US attempts to use aid cuts as leverage, it may not have the same impact as it did in previous years. Burkina Faso's government is already working on a self-sufficiency model, making it less vulnerable to economic blackmail. Another factor that could make Burkina Faso more resistant to US pressure is the growing African movement against neo-colonial influence. In recent years, there has been a strong wave of anti-imperialist sentiment across Africa, with many countries rejecting Western control over their economies, politics, and resources. Nations like Mali, Guinea, and Niger have already expelled French troops, pushed back against foreign interference, and embraced a new vision of African sovereignty. Burkina Faso is part of this movement, and the government is unlikely to abandon its land reforms just because Western powers disapprove. If anything, U.S. threats could strengthen domestic support for the policy, as many Burkina-based citizens see this law as a step toward breaking free from foreign exploitation. Ultimately, the question is not whether the U.S. or Western countries will try to pressure Burkina Faso. History suggests they will. The real question is whether Burkina Faso will stay firm in its decision, just like South Africa did. Given the country's current trajectory, all signs point to a leadership that is determined to hold its ground, even in the face of external threats. But how far is the U.S. willing to go to stop Burkina Faso's land reforms? Will it resort to diplomatic threats, financial punishments, or even more aggressive economic tactics? And most importantly, will Africa stand by Burkina Faso if the West attempts to undermine its sovereignty? Burkina Faso has made its choice. It has decided that its land will remain in the hands of its people, not in the portfolios of foreign investors. Whether Western powers like it or not, this decision represents a new era of African resistance against economic exploitation. Now, the world is waiting to see whether Burkina Faso will face the same battles that South Africa fought, or whether this time Africa is too strong to be bullied into submission. Do you think Burkina Faso will back down? Can the U.S. force it to? Let us know in the comment section. What will happen if the U.S. fails here too? Will more nations follow in Burkina Faso's footsteps? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.